I would like to introduce our first speaker. I'm going to introduce the speaker. I'll also introduce the discussants right at the beginning so that it can flow relatively seamlessly, at least we hope. The first panel is entitled, Must Diplomats Choose Between Promoting Justice and Their National Interests? Reflections of a Multilateral Negotiator. We're blessed today to have Ambassador Jennifer Haverkamp, who is an internationally recognized expert on climate change and international trade, global environmental policy, and negotiations. In her role as the director of the Graham Sustainability Institute at the University of Michigan, she leads the institute in facilitating sustainability-focused collaboration between faculty, students, and external stakeholders. She served in the State Department as an ambassador and special representative for the environment and water resources, where she led climate negotiations under the Montreal Protocol and the UN Civil Aviation Organization. She previously served as a visiting distinguished professor of practice at Cornell Law School, where I had the good fortune of teaching a class with her. I was actually her student. I just couldn't let on because I had to pretend to be a co-instructor, but I learned so much just from sitting in that class with her. She led the International Climate Program at the Environmental Defense Fund and served in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Justice Department's Environment and Natural Resource Division. She earned her law degree from Yale. She was a Rhodes Scholar, where she earned a master's degree in politics and philosophy at Oxford University and majored in biology at the College of Worcester. The first discussant following Professor Haverkamp's presentation will be Susan Rose Ackerman. Susan Rose Ackerman is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Law and Political Science Emeritus at Yale and professorial lecturer at the Yale Law School. Her book, Democracy and Executive Power, Policymaking Accountability in the United States, the UK, Germany, and France, is forthcoming from Yale Press in 2021. She is the author or co-author of 7 books, including Controlling Environmental Policy, The Limits of Public Law in Germany and the United States, Rethinking the Progressive Agenda, The Reform of the American Regulatory State, and The Uncertain Search for Environmental Quality. She holds a PhD in economics from Yale. Her research interests include comparative administrative law and regulatory policy, with a focus on environmental policy, the political economy of corruption, law, and economics. The student discussant is Paul Byrne Burrow, who's an environmental anthropologist and a PhD candidate in the combined doctoral degree program between the School of the Environment and the Department of Anthropology here at Yale. His work examines the cultural dynamics of environmental change in the American West, looking at how indigenous and non-indigenous rural communities are impacted by changing ecosystems that are tied to historical land use practices, climate change, and settler colonialism. He also studies environmental governance and asks how rural communities, indigenous nations, and U.S. federal governments interact over contentious land management issues in forest and rangelands in California and Nevada. He is currently working on a National Science Foundation funded project to examine the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on rural communities in the U.S. West, and his work has previously appeared in Environment and Society, Environmental Research Letters, Springer's Studies in Human Ecology and Adaptation series, and forthcoming volume in Public Lands in the Western United States, Places in Politics in the Clash Between Public and Private. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jennifer. I'm Professor Haverkamp, who we'll see her presentation, then we'll have discussion. So let's go. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and greetings from Ann Arbor, Michigan. I so wish that I could be with you in person, but that's the world we now live in. I look forward to an interesting few days on this important and timely conference's topic of environmental justice, and am bringing to you my thoughts on the question of, must diplomats choose between promoting justice and promoting their national interests? I bring you these thoughts from a career as a negotiator in multilateral environmental fora. So these aren't academic thoughts, these are more the reflections of a practitioner. I'd like to talk today about two different kinds of justice. Procedural justice, in other words, the fair and equitable participation in the process of a negotiation and its implementation, and also distributive justice, which is how the rewards and the costs, or the obligations and the benefits of an international agreement are shared among the parties. To give you a sense of where I'll be taking us in this conversation, my impression is that the international institutions and governments with which I'm familiar have done a pretty good job of addressing equity and justice concerns in the process of negotiations and meaningful implementation. Also, many of the international environmental agreements have, with mixed success, incorporated justice into the substantive outcomes of those negotiations, the obligations and the benefits to the parties. But I would say that it's rare to find examples of parties bringing justice into the outcome in ways that did not otherwise align with what they already perceived to be their national interests in those negotiations. First, let's talk a little bit about where the problems are with procedural justice in the negotiating process. Why it's a challenge, why there are such inequities. The first one that comes to mind is language. English is now the lingua franca of the global negotiating world, and if that is not your native language or you're not fluent in it, you are disadvantaged. Even though the formal sessions have simultaneous interpretation in the 5 official languages of the UN, many times countries break off into smaller groups to negotiate particular topics, or the negotiations may continue long into the night after the interpreters have gone home, and those who don't speak English fluently are at a definite disadvantage. Another real area of inequity is just in the wealth of the countries who are around the table. This is manifested in the size of the negotiating teams and the support that they have. Large, wealthy parties like the United States have an enormous advantage in complex multilateral negotiations because they can marshal a large delegation, sometimes 40, 50 people at a big UN climate conference. They have specialized experts, they have analytics, they have cost calculations, they have agencies back home who have been modeling results for them to give them a real sense of what the benefits and costs are to them. At the opposite extreme, you'll find countries represented by maybe a single representative who's at the delegation of the New York UN office or the Geneva UN office. They're supposed to be covering multiple portfolios and they have little background in them. Another hurdle to fair and complete participation is the fact that these negotiations are taking place all over the globe. When there's an active negotiation, there can be 5 or 6 sessions over the course of a year, each of them being hosted by a different country on a different continent. Also, the time investment is spread out over many years. It can take several years just to reach agreement to launch a negotiation, and then the negotiations themselves can continue over several years. Even once the mandate for the Uruguay round of WTO negotiations was agreed upon, the negotiations themselves, culminating in the creation of the WTO, took 7 years. So there are, fortunately, a lot of examples out there of how inequities in the negotiating process have been alleviated, and these can be good models for other fora. To address the problem of size of delegation, parties often negotiate in like-minded or regional blocks where they can divvy up the expertise or responsibility and have their perspectives represented by colleagues. For instance, in the UN International Climate Conference, the UNCCC, the Africa Group is a group of 54 countries that negotiate together. The Small Island Developing States, or SIDS, negotiate together. The Least Developing Countries negotiate together. This helps with the process. Also, fortunately, quite a few of these international institutions have mechanisms to financially support the participation in the negotiations by those who couldn't otherwise afford to attend. You see in the UNCCC a trust fund, which exists to broaden parties' participation. They fund up to 3 participants from a least developed country in the annual Conference of Parties, for instance, and they also support the participation in trainings and workshops that are conducted by the least developed countries experts group. You also, through the UN, have funds for least developed country ministers to participate in a wide range of UN negotiations, also some of the WTO negotiations. And speaking again of the WTO, they had in 2014, as more and more new countries were joining the WTO, countries who had little prior history with the trading system and its obligations, they created in 2014 the WTO Institute for Training and Technical Cooperation, which provides a wide range of services for countries to participate more effectively in these negotiations. You also have think tanks, trade associations, nonprofits who often expend quite a bit of effort to help fill the knowledge gap for representatives from less developed countries and small delegations, helping them keep track of these negotiations. But of course, these groups often have a particular perspective that they're hoping the countries they're talking to will share. So there is a tension here between justice and efficiency, especially in these large and complex multilateral negotiations. When you think about it, the UN has 193 member countries, and many of the multilateral environmental agreements have many, if not all, of those countries as party to those agreements. So these negotiations are huge and complex. One scholar, Johanna DePledge, has observed that, and I'm quoting her, excessive concern with procedural equity and transparency can jeopardize the reaching of agreement. She cautions that effective agreements depend on striking a good balance between procedural equity and efficiency. And in my experience, this rings true. These huge negotiations already are complicated and take a lot of time. They couldn't drive to a final outcome without some procedural corner cutting, without recognizing that some players have more weight in the negotiation than others. Deals aren't going to be struck with every party squeezed into the back room, with every session having complete interpretation, or with every delegate being heard out on every point of contention. You just can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good and achieve the overall agreements that are supposed to be in the best interest of all the parties. So the other place where procedural justice matters is at the opposite end of the negotiations, which is after you've achieved an agreement and you're working on its implementation. And this is another place where it's important to address the inequities among parties. And fortunately, there are some good examples to be drawn upon of where that's happening. Again, more needs to be done, but some good examples. Looking to the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, which is responsible for global civil aviation. They have an initiative called No Country Left Behind, which they started in 2014, seeing troublesome discrepancies in how different member states were implementing the standards and recommended practices around safety and security. So This entity is all about helping ensure that the implementation of these obligations is better harmonized globally so that the least developed states and countries in transition have the assistance they need to come up to the necessary standards. Great example of an agreement being successful because of the work done to make the implementation fair is the Montreal Protocol again. It has a multilateral fund dedicated to helping developing countries manage their national programs to comply with their Montreal Protocol obligations. This fund is filled by contributions from developed countries, which have done quite a good job over the years of maintaining the contributions expected of them. And one of the specific ways this fund helps is each country has a national ozone unit for implementation, and the least developed countries' national ozone units are funded through this fund. The WTO has a whole range of technical assistance and training programs to help with implementation. And then on the environmental side, you have the Global Environment Facility, which was created in 1992 on the eve of the Rio Earth Summit. It serves as a financial mechanism to help developing countries and countries with economies in transition meet the objectives of 5 major multilateral environmental agreements, including the UNCCC. So turning now to distributive justice. Again, like procedural justice, you can look at the multilateral environmental agreements and see several incorporations, successful incorporations of distributive justice principles, and especially in the environmental agreements, you can see this. The language recognizing inequities across the parties can be included in a number of different ways. Preambles to these agreements often note the importance of taking into account countries' different circumstances, their different levels of development. And then following from the preambles, these differences are often reflected in the obligations. Different types of obligations, they can include waivers, exemptions from certain obligations, delayed timelines for when the obligation kicks in based on your status as a developing country, less onerous reporting requirements, and that sort of thing. The meaning of these phrases as they're put into the agreements and then how they are interpreted down the road are some of the most contentious debates in the negotiations. Famous is the UNCCC's provisions. Article 3, paragraph 1 from the Framework Convention itself in 1992 says, the parties should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations of humankind on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. This principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is so frequently invoked and debated that it's known simply by its acronym, CBDR. So while such principles and provisions clearly embody justice principles, the motivations behind their incorporation into a particular agreement can be complex. And I'll illustrate this with some examples from some of the climate agreements. CBDR in the UNCCC, in its most stark interpretation, it was understood to create a sharp dividing line between developed and developing countries, with the burden of remedial action falling first or only on the former, the developed countries. This division was embodied in the Berlin Mandate, which is the mandate that launched the negotiations that led to the Kyoto Protocol. And from the Berlin Mandate, only developed countries were to have emission reduction targets. For many of the proponents of this provision, The outcome was motivated and justified by the concept of historical responsibility. That is, that most of the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere were the result of a century's worth of emissions by countries in the course of their economic development, who are now the wealthy developed countries. In other words, having them take on obligations before developing countries is a just and equitable outcome. However, taking a longer view and looking back, many now see the Kyoto Protocol as a failure because the United States never joined that agreement. It's also the case when you look closely at the negotiating history that this divide between developed and developing countries was not driven entirely by justice considerations. Notably, you have such advocates as Saudi Arabia and major oil companies who knew that the lack of obligation for developing countries, and for China in particular, was a poison pill that would prevent the United States from ever agreeing to ratify the protocol. So fast forward 15 years from Kyoto to the Paris Agreement in 2015. Paris has a very different structure, arguably more equitable and more just. In Paris, the stark CBR division was displaced in favor of all parties assuming greenhouse gas mitigation responsibilities in the form of voluntary and non-binding nationally determined contributions. For one thing, the stark divide in Kyoto had become very out of date as some of those developing countries had become emerging economies, economies in transition, who had more wealth, per capita wealth, than some of the countries supposedly on the developed country side of the ledger. So that stark divide really needed to be revisited. So in the Paris Agreement, each country sets its commitments based on its own unique circumstances and capabilities. This is a structure that was strongly advocated by the United States. But I would argue that for the United States negotiators, any consideration of justice in how they conceived of this plan was aligned with and was largely less important than the United States' other negotiating priorities. And those were to get an agreement that included China on a comparable footing, and to get agreement that by virtue of the absence of binding obligations would not trigger the need to go to Congress for ratification of a treaty, assuming that Congress would be, at that point, quite hostile. Another climate example comes from ICAO, the UN Civil Aviation Organization. And I find this one especially interesting example of countries grappling with the equitable sharing of obligations. ICAO's founding document is the 1944 Chicago Convention. And this document enshrines the principle of non-discrimination. In other words, that all parties to the agreement equally assume obligations and share benefits. And as I mentioned before, the way ICAO addresses the special circumstances of developing countries is through providing them with assistance in the implementation of the obligations through their No Country Left Behind initiative. This is their bedrock principle, non-discrimination. Well, in 2016, ICAO's world was rocked by the international climate world when the ICAO parties came together to negotiate a climate agreement. They succeeded. The agreement, called CORSIA, obligates airlines to offset the greenhouse gas emissions from their flights for anything above a 2020 baseline of emissions levels. Now, the emerging economies like China, as they came into these ICAO negotiations, having just completed the Paris Agreement, demanded that instead of non-discrimination, ICAO's principle should be replaced with CBDR and with voluntary differentiated national obligations. I'll spare you the complex details of that resulting agreement, though happy to talk about it later. But it ended up somewhere in the middle. It includes both elements of non-discrimination, and it includes special exceptions for least developed countries and for small island states. And perhaps not surprisingly, the last big issue to be resolved was a provision that was hotly contested between the United States and China over whether developed countries should take the lead in reducing emissions from their airlines. The outcome, as was often the case in these UN climate negotiations, is that outstanding lawyering eventually produced a carefully worded text that each side could read as meeting its bottom line. And I will give a shout out to the outstanding lawyer, Sue Biniaz, who achieved that on behalf of the United States. So our conference chairs have asked us to consider the question, is tempering national interests advisable or plausible? What led to these outcomes that have environmental justice incorporated in them? Are the examples of negotiators who have recognized compelling justice arguments and incorporated them into the agreements? Or are these outcomes driven primarily by other dynamics in the negotiation? Put another way, how often do negotiators take a position because it's right versus because it helps to conclude a deal that they already want to reach? I don't want to sound too cynical, but I would say that in the negotiations I've observed, I've seen much, much more of the latter. And frankly, if we get to the same outcome with the justice embodied in the agreement, how significant is the distinction over what the motivation of the negotiators was? I also view this as a bit of a semantic question. When negotiations produce outcomes that incorporate justice and that address the inequities between the parties, once that's happened, wouldn't the negotiators say that they've brought home an agreement consistent with their national interests? In other words, have they redefined their national interests to incorporate that outcome because in doing so, they've also delivered on or protected their primary objectives in the negotiation? I doubt there's a clear answer or a one-size-fits-all answer. In trying to understand the impediments to moving, for a negotiator to move beyond their narrow nationalistic interests and why that may not be plausible, it will help to consider how negotiators understand their role in the process and the constraints under which they operate. So one thing to keep in mind is that the representatives of parties at these multilateral negotiations are mostly career diplomats. Their job is to represent their current government's leadership. They're used to following those instructions. They take their marching orders from their capitals. And by the time they arrive at these negotiations, they really don't have a lot of room to operate outside of their instructions. It's also the fact, as I mentioned, that to even have agreed to launch a particular negotiation, countries have gone through a long process to determine whether reaching an agreement in this area is in their national interest. And once those negotiations are launched, and various parties have shifted away from their efforts to delay or obstruct there even being a deal, everybody around the table, once they agree that they want a deal, their focus becomes, what do I have to give the other side in order to achieve what I need to take away from this deal? And what the other side needs might look like a just and equitable outcome, but I'm looking at it through, what do I have to give you in order to get what I need? These negotiators have to bring home an agreement that can be accepted and ratified by their domestic institutions. For the United States, this means being highly sensitive to what Congress would support. So that's another interest that they have to be responsive to and focused on. They not only need to achieve their country's bottom line affirmative goals, but they can't bring home an agreement that has objectionable provisions in it. And they can't bring home an agreement that has achieved their goals at too high a cost in concessions to the other side. So what I think this all means is that when negotiators are considering the circumstances of other parties in the negotiation, they're focused mostly on what do those parties need to reach a deal that's acceptable to their own respective home governments. The negotiators are going to be looking for ways to accommodate those bottom line needs of the other party because they're focused on finalizing an agreement. They're not focused on whether it's just or fair to the other side to achieve a certain outcome. Yet another factor that complicates the role of justice and equity considerations in any of these negotiations is the fact that these negotiations are not occurring in a vacuum in just that particular fora or just under that particular umbrella agreement. So judging an outcome based on its equity merit is complicated by the fact that they're not sealed off from global affairs. The parties are taking positions based on sometimes extraneous considerations, like what does my main foreign aid benefactor want out of this agreement? Or what are the power dynamics in my region? If I am a small Middle Eastern state and I cross Saudi Arabia, will it have rippling implications elsewhere? Maybe sometimes I'm trying to make a trade with another country around the table. I'll give you this in this negotiation if you give me that somewhere else. For example, with the Kyoto Protocol, the EU allegedly supported Russia's accession to the WTO in exchange for Russia joining Kyoto. There's another thing I'd like to note in terms of trying to address equity and justice concerns in negotiations, and that is the concerns of stakeholders that are not represented at the nation-state level. Many of the multilateral agreements and institutions that we've been talking about have found ways to accommodate or at least acknowledge the disparities and inequities among countries, whether they're a developing country, a developed country, a least developed country at the nation-state level. But what's especially difficult to advance in these large multilateral negotiations are the interests of disadvantaged or underrepresented minorities within a party, where those interests might be overshadowed by major economic interests of that country or dominant ethnic or political factions. And perhaps one example of this is the role of indigenous peoples in the UN climate negotiations. Groups who are coming together around common interests that cut across their national boundaries. The indigenous groups are very active now in the UN negotiations. They come and are visible presence arguing their perspectives. But it's still the case that to achieve results in the text of the agreements, they still need to have a country or countries who will embrace and champion their positions at the negotiating table. As part of this, to wrap up this part of the conversation, I want to just give you a couple examples of blurry lines between national interest and justice motivations on the part of negotiators. First is one from the WTO. In 2001, the parties in Doha, where they were trying to launch a new round of trade liberalization, reached agreement on the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS Agreement and public health. TRIPS Agreement is the intellectual property agreement. This declaration created a waiver from the intellectual property rules to allow developing countries to have access to essential medicines to address public health emergencies. The motivations behind this obviously just decision are not clear-cut. On the one hand, the United States' decision to support this waiver was bitterly opposed by the pharmaceutical companies who are and have been extremely powerful players in US trade policy. And so you would say the United States was prioritizing poor countries' health concerns over our own domestic national economic interests. On the other hand, U.S. support for this TRIPS waiver may have been strategically critical to achieving the United States' broader goal in Doha, which was to leave with the mandate to launch the new round of trade liberalization, which they did achieve. Another example is to share with you is from the Montreal Protocol, where I would say that to lay the groundwork for this one, when proponents of a particular international environmental agreement, once they have figured out what they consider the necessary or most desirable environmental outcome, then they are amenable to making concessions or offering benefits to other parties that are necessary to bring the recalcitrant parties along to share in achieving that overall environmental goal. And an example of this comes from the 2016 negotiations of the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which was an agreement to phase down hydrofluorocarbons, which are a potent greenhouse gas. And the US team, who were big proponents of the Kigali Amendment, had calculated carefully with a lot of modeling what countries had to do in order to achieve the significant climate benefits we are trying to achieve, which is potentially up to 0.5 degree of warming averted this century. And calculated that the year when developing countries needed to freeze their production and use of hydrofluorocarbons was way earlier than the year that most developing countries were willing to take on. So to sweeten this pot, US negotiators persuaded several of the other developed countries to join pledging an additional $27 million for the multilateral fund for fast start financing, with this money very explicitly being available only if the recipient countries agreed to an ambitious amendment with a sufficiently early freeze date. And they also persuaded private philanthropy to step up as well and contribute another $53 million for this transition. And the prospect of these funds was announced several weeks before the final negotiating session, so that they were there as an incentive. So you might ask, was this offer of financial contribution done for justice reasons? No. Did it make the demand for greater ambition by the developing countries a more equitable demand? Yes. So next. So just to conclude my remarks here, you've heard me say, to recap this, in my experience, countries are doing a fairly good job of addressing procedural justice concerns with respect to substantive obligations and benefits. They're doing okay, but I would say significant transfers of funding, especially as compensation for past actions, can be extremely difficult to achieve. Anything that has the whiff of reparations or addressing historical responsibility is pretty severely resisted, in part because public finance is in limited supply and hard to attribute it to compensation when it ought to be perhaps going to resilience or adaptation instead. Across both procedural and substantive dimensions, much more can and should be done to incorporate these justice concerns. But advocates of these outcomes will have more success if they persuade a party that addressing these concerns is in alignment with that party's national interest, as opposed to the advocates making the case on moral grounds. Also, the advocacy efforts should be targeted to decision makers in the national capitals, where the negotiating instructions are written, and also onto the bodies responsible for ratifying a completed agreement. It's very powerful if Congress tells you, don't bring that agreement home unless blank is in there. That's very motivating for negotiators. And in sum, this work should be done well in advance of these large final negotiating sessions. If you're hanging around in the halls of the conference center trying to influence the negotiators at that stage, that's a very heavy lift. They've already been equipped with their negotiating instructions. They have a settled understanding of their country's national interests, and they're just trying to find a deal. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion and to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Haverkamp. Well, I'd like to invite our discussants to join us. I've already introduced them. You've given us a lot to think about, and I hope that that when we get to the questions from the audience and when we hear the remarks of discussion, we can push some of the points you made, so make them a little bit sharper. I think they had the virtue of reality. I think that's important. So now I'd like to introduce Susan Rose Ackerman. I've given her full introduction earlier, so I'll just turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you, Jennifer. That was very interesting and nice, sort of realistic presentation of what to expect if you're engaged in one of these and one of these negotiations. I wanted to just raise some questions related to your experience that kind of try to put it a little bit in context. So I think that it's important to contrast the negotiations over civil aviation with the negotiations over climate. And even though there's a link because the airplanes are contributing to global warming, there is a sense in which organizing the relationship between airlines is something that's at some level in the interest of all of the countries with airplanes, and the incentive for peeling off and letting other people do it seems to me not so present as in the climate change agreement, because you might not be able to fly your airplanes where you'd like to have them flown if you weren't actually actively working part of this agreement. I'm sure you've got counter examples to that, but as a general matter, it's something where there's a public good in providing these this international body, and the incentives for individuals once peeling off is, I think, not so large as in the climate change context, where, as we know, it's an entirely global issue. So that unless you have good enforcement mechanisms, if a country doesn't comply with whatever has been agreed to, it doesn't hurt them very much in terms of purely of climate stuff, because it's a global issue. And so some thoughts about the kind of the underlying just difficulty of coming to agreements on some things relative to others. And of course, climate is also something that involves a lot of spending, there's a lot of resources that need to go into that. I also, as I understood, and you would know better than I do, that the ozone layer negotiations, at least initially, were helped by the fact that an American chemical company had invented a substitute for chlorofluorocarbons, so that made it easy for the United States to be furthering what was seen as a pro-environment position without opposition from at least parts of industry, and in fact even support from the parts of industry that were producing substitutes. So once again, there's this kind of question of how generalizable your experience in the civil aviation and the ozone context is to worrying about some kind of climate change negotiation that actually has some teeth. I mean, as we all know, Paris is very nice, but it doesn't have a lot of teeth in it. So that's a kind of general question for you or for anybody else. I was very happy to see you mention what I think is an extremely important issue, which has to do with the fact that the negotiations are between countries, and of course, with 193 countries, what counts as a country can range from something with under 100,000 people up to China, right, and India. So the notion that these are the things around the table trying to come up with something is sort of inherently a difficult problem of how to manage that. And then on top of that, or at least as a part of that, really, inside a big country like the United States or Brazil or China or India, there are all kinds of people whose interests may accord more easily with those of the people in low-income countries, or maybe have some distinctive features. And I don't know whether you talked about some examples, but I wonder if some of this has been at all incorporated into the way in which people think about international negotiations, because we're still in this world in which it's nation states that are doing it, and that's the UN, of course, and some of these issues seem to demand a kind of broader concern. Part of that is looking to the role of certain kinds of civil society organizations that represent the particular groups, but of course then still we have a representation issue. So I'm wondering if there's any interesting thinking about how to get around some of these problems of the fact that we've channeled the kind of interest representation notion into the nation state at the international level in a way that it may fit less well with the problems that you're trying to deal with. Then let me just think. I think one of the things that's important to think about, which you also raised, is the what do we mean when we're talking about distributive justice? And one first way to say it is it okay to pay off the losers? Some of your examples of how people were, countries were induced to agree to some agreement was to say, okay, we'll give you some money to deal with this, and then that helps. So then we should, then a second question is, how is that money getting used in the countries that it's going to, and are there people who would argue that it's inappropriate to mix money, with this discussion over fairness or some other things? I come from an economics background, so I tend to not be too dulled about the simple use of financial incentives, but the real problem may be that who is it that's benefiting from those financial incentives within a country that has a relatively weak institutional or corrupt institutional structure. Then the second part of this question is, how do we think about justice, which I have seen in other contexts as well. To me, and this is once again my economics background, I think, too much of a focus on historical offenses and not enough, I don't mean you, but I mean some of this discussion, too much just focus on history and not enough on present day inequalities. Now, in many cases, those overlap. The people who are presently in the bad way or suffering from climate change may be there in part because of historical actions by other countries or by other people in the countries where they are. But these are quite different notions of justice. And somehow the historical link is more attractive to people in some of these discussions than, to me, the concern with people today who are being disadvantaged by climate change or by corruption or other kinds of problems. And then you also mentioned the kind of a third issue, which is if you're going to use money in some way, why shouldn't it be used for mitigating the actual problem rather than dealing with poverty or dealing with historical generally or historical things. I think that's in the background. I think of some of the things that you were talking about, and I think it's important. The other thing I think I just close with is that you were very much emphasizing the idea that people were coming to these meetings as representatives of their countries with rather clear ideas of what their countries wanted. And I assume that is because that's the realistic way of understanding your that explains your experience or describes your experience. But of course, one other notion of what happens in a negotiation is that you're trying to convince people of things. So you're trying to make arguments that people might agree with, and that there may be some tension between that kind of process in which you're actually trying to persuade people in the negotiation versus trying to just get them to agree because you have accommodated their interests through some kind of side deal that doesn't involve them changing their minds, just involve them saying, well, I guess we're not so badly off because you're going to compensate. And I would be interested to hear what kind of experience you have with that, because maybe it's basically the UN is just too unwieldy. If you do them with 193 nations, you can't really expect anybody to really be discussing things. But it was, I would just end by wondering about that other part of the way in which at least some kinds of negotiations are thought about, compared with simply a kind of a balancing off things that may work. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be part of this conference again. I should just mention that Natasha, in whose honor this is being organized, was a student of mine when she was at Yale, and she was a wonderful person, very concerned with all of the issues that are before us today. So I think it's a particularly fitting event to have here. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. You raised some really critical questions that I hope we can follow up in the question and answer period, particularly the realistic question of how negotiations actually function. That is, what are the trade-offs that actually get made, even in light of or in view of the instructions that the negotiators get before they come to the table. I'd like to turn the floor over now to Paul Burrows for further responses to Ambassador Haverkamp. Is Paul here? I don't see him. Oh, there he is. Okay, good. All right, Paul, it's all yours.
All right, great. Thank you so much. By acknowledging my presence here at Lake Tahoe on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Washoe people. I want to thank the conference organizers and staff for their hard work to make this event possible, no less in a time of great national turmoil over the coronavirus pandemic, but also a turnover in presidential administrations. And these are both things that are testing the resilience of our democratic institutions. And thank you specifically to Gerald Torres and Amity Doolittle for the invitation to present here. And I'm grateful to also be able to comment along with Professor Susan Rose Ackerman, who we just heard from. So our speaker this afternoon, Professor Jennifer Haverkamp, provided a fascinating and thoughtful look into the world of negotiating multilateral transnational agreements. She showed the value of a practitioner's perspective and draws upon the experiences of those in the room to evaluate the practices that give rise to institutional frameworks for environmental, social, and environmental impacts on communities around the globe. Now, I'm an anthropologist who studies the social impacts of climate change through the lens of the lived experiences of people in particular places at particular times. So when I think about global climate agreements, I see this through the lens of what it means for a place in space and among diverse communities that often do not have a seat at the table, yet are profoundly impacted by these negotiations. So I'd like to draw attention to that context in my remarks. Professor Haverkamp's experience as a negotiator provide rich material from which to consider how conceptions of justice are not only embedded in institutional frameworks themselves, but emerge in a larger socio-political context. In answer to Professor Haverkamp's question incorporated into the title of her talk, must diplomats choose between promoting justice and their national interest? It would seem the answer is yes, but perhaps it needs explore the very issue by drawing out the larger context in which society imagines the national interest in forms of justice that are embedded in procedural rules and immediate substantive outcomes, but with instrumental effects far beyond the scope of international agreements. Professor Haverkamp focused on two important forms of justice, distributive justice and procedural justice, and I would like to add to this of epistemic justice. What is epistemic justice for those who aren't familiar with this literature? I'm going to draw upon the moral philosopher Miranda Fricker. And Fricker writes about two different forms of justice, and I'll share a bit from her work here. She says, quote, for these two forms, testimonial injustice occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give a deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word. And then she also talks about hermeneutical, or what I'm just going to refer to as interpretive injustice, which occurs at a prior stage when a gap in collective interpretive resources puts someone at an unfair disadvantage when it comes to making sense of their social experiences. If we extend this matter of epistemic justice to the case of multilateral negotiations, I would like to pose several questions that we might consider in the discussion that Professor Haverkamp might offer insight into. So first, how might institutional transformation, justice, and negotiations over international frameworks for environmental protection? What role does knowledge play in these negotiations? How do diverse experiences and ways of knowing for communities within and across the globe? In other words, whose knowledge counts? And I would draw attention to Professor Haverkamp's example of transnational organizing by indigenous communities in relation to the UNFCCC. I think that might be a productive example to consider. Another question, when thinking about transnational environmental justice issues like climate change, how do the lived experiences of communities come to matter for diplomats charged with negotiating on their behalf? And here I might, pose the question, how do diplomats think? And so again, their own sort of lived experiences and what role that plays, but also their sense of the lived experiences of communities, perhaps in their own nation or across the globe. A third question. Are there more opportunities to create transnational groups that might influence their own national governments to pursue negotiations with justice as a matter of the national interest? So, for example, what about working class interests in industrialized democracies? And then the second area that I'd like to ask about is considering the role of domestic politics, so domestic political institutions, constituencies, and social movements in influencing an age-old issue in international political theory. How do domestic politics shape international politics? What is the relationship between domestic political institutions and conditions and policies sought by national governments? And so in thinking in this context, I would like to ask about procedural justice and what it might look like when we scale above one negotiating framework to the whole approach that a nation or nations generally take to negotiating in general. what are the opportunities there to shape norms and practices on the level of how these frameworks is to think about procedural justice, not just as the rules to the game in a specific context, but more broadly in society and across nations. And we can ask a similar question about the scale upon which we think about distributive justice within a particular framework, but also broader than that, outside of that. And then my last question here is, what are some of the strategies for seeking to align national interests with distributional justice? So if as incorporating procedural and distributive justice concerns in negotiating processes and also in substantive outcomes, then what is driving that success? If that is getting included, how does that come to be? How do we explain this? And then I guess the final thing, and this would be drawing a connection with some of the comments that were shared by Professor Rose Ackerman, and also a little bit earlier, thinking about historical path dependencies and concerns for reparative justice in the present. I think that's like a really fruitful conversation to have. In my mind, there is no it's very difficult to untangle the two. They're linked, but this sounds like a productive place to also have conversation. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Susan. Are we waiting? Am I the only one on the stage? I think we're waiting for the rest of the folks to come up on stage. I think. Hello.
Hello.
I think we're
There she is. It just has a J, but she's
there. Hi, Jennifer. Welcome.
Hey, everybody.
No, Paul, those were just so exciting to have all three of those in conversation with each other. And I feel like there are many, many places to start. I think the first place I would start was asking if Jennifer wanted to respond to some of the items that were brought out by either Susan or Paul.
Thanks, Amity. And first, can everybody hear me okay? Is that working? Great.
I think so, yeah.
Okay, good. First, I guess I would like to start with my own land acknowledgement, being here at the University of Michigan, which is that the university's origins are in a land grant that came from the Anishinaabe and the Wyandot Indians and Native Americans, and need to acknowledge that. Then I would just want to thank Susan and Paul for your really thoughtful consideration of my presentation and the issues that you raised. There's a whole lot there, so I don't know exactly where to start, but a few thoughts. I think that Susan, you raised a really valuable point about the distinctions between, say, what are the obligations and what are the motivations for countries to participate in something like the UN Civil Aviation Organization versus the UNCCC. There are probably more reasons to have the same obligations across the board so that there's the certainty of safety and security in flight, no matter what airline you're getting on around the world. And this is why those negotiations became so complicated when they were taking on climate obligations. And you had to figure out what was the equitable way of bringing those obligations on board with different countries. And I guess also your comments about the Montreal Protocol and what brought that on board. Very true that a significant aspect of its success and the U.S. being a primary motivator of getting that negotiation launched was the fact that there were already alternatives to CFC that were known, and frankly, that U.S. companies had designed and were going to benefit from. That is not that different from the situation now in the efforts to implement the Kigali Amendment on hydrofluorocarbons, where, again, what I think distinguishes that agreement from the UNCCC is that it has broad industry support, in part because there are alternatives to HFCs, which are out there and can be used, and that some of the U.S. domestic companies would benefit from their wider use. It's also, however, the case that a lot of the alternatives to HFCs are also things like alcohol and other hydrocarbons, which have been around for a long time, which are low cost. This segues a little bit into what I think, Paul, maybe you raised, or maybe forget which one of you did, about the role of persuasion in negotiations and whether countries just come together static and are making a deal, or whether they're actually trying to also change each other's minds. And at least in the HFC negotiations, a very large part of some of the developing countries being able to move their position from long delays in implementation and opposition was very much discussions around what are the alternatives, what are the costs of alternatives, how soon will they be available. Some of the refrigerants for automobile air conditioning, for instance, are expensive now, but being able to say those patents are going to expire before your obligations kick in was a very important piece of moving their negotiating position. But again, and maybe I overemphasize this, but those kinds of conversations are seldom happening in that last week or that last 2 weeks where a final deal is coming together. We had a couple years of technical exchanges between government negotiators, NGOs, and companies. There's a whole dialogue with the US and India where we were working through all these issues and talking through all these alternatives to help them see it more accurately in terms of what their options were and what the costs to them would be. But it's still the case that, you know, India held out for a much later freeze date than China and most of the other developing countries, and it was a very, very understandable, significant concern around the cost that might be put on their people, where especially as the planet is warming, there's greater and greater need for air conditioning, not as a wealthy person's luxury, but basically for your survival in heat waves. So that was an issue. Let's see. Do you guys want to pipe up on what you especially would hope I respond to in terms of what?
Well, I can also help out a little bit here. We've got a few questions coming up in the chat, and I just wanted to remind people, sorry, not the chat. You can put your questions in the question bar, and I'm monitoring that and can bring those up to the discussion level. But I was also really struck by your comment, and I can't remember who, the negotiator who said, I've actually heard a UN Red representative say a similar thing to me. Whoops, we lost Jennifer, I think. Could someone bring Jennifer back to the stage? Well, I'll go on with my comment and maybe she'll come back because I think it falls in line with what Paul was talking about, a UN Red negotiator once said to me, if I paid any attention to Indigenous people's FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent, I'd never get anything done. And it was interesting to hear that being said again. And it leaves me with this really big unanswered question about the relationship between the, whether you want to say idealists or abstract thinkers, the philosophers who worry about these issues of justice and equity, and the complexities of just getting things done in today's world. So, hi.
I'm terribly sorry. As you might have noticed, I got kicked off right as you were asking the question.
Yeah.
But could you just briefly repeat it? I'm so sorry.
No, that's all right. I kept saying it to entertain whoever was there. But I was really struck by the comment you made by one of the negotiators, who basically said, if I pay attention to, or pay too much attention to procedural issues, we'll never get anything done. And I was recounting, I've also had a UN representative from the UN Red group say to me, if I paid any attention to free, prior, and informed consent with Indigenous people, I'd never get anything done. And so suddenly you see this concept of procedural justice, of recognition justice, which you didn't talk about, but is embedded in it, being thrown out the window. And you know, you had the adage, don't let perfect be the enemy of getting things done. And so I was just pondering this bigger question of how stuck are we in this world of, whether it be the idealists or the philosophers or those concerned with issues of equity and those who are working to get things done. Is that a bridge that can we make those ends meet in some way? Or are we in fact stuck with this, what feels rather imperfect, but way to move forward?
Can I just add to something there?
Yeah.
Because there is this, I think, simple idea of procedural justice in an international negotiation, that it means that every country is treated equally. I don't think that follows. You know, everybody should get heard, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that what is just is a kind of level playing field at the country level, right? Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah,
it's a great point. I just want to note that the quote that I had about the trade-offs wasn't from a negotiator; it was from a scholar who was writing about that topic. I think, Susan, your point is great, that you really want to pick apart what is just in this circumstance, and it isn't necessarily each country treated equally, which is why I think that some of the examples I gave of trying to countries trying to band together around their common interests are ways to help make sure voices are heard in a more efficient way. And you know, I think that in a lot of international fora, they have decision-making rules that allow for voting, which, you know, raises all the questions that you have about, you know, how do you deal with minority perspectives in majority vote situations? What I think makes both the UNCCC and the WTO somewhat unusual is that for a lot of things, consensus is the expected norm. And one reason you have consensus in the UNCCC is because countries have never been able to agree to rules of procedure. And so they never agreed to voting rules, which has meant that often one or just a couple countries can hold out and block agreement that the vast majority of countries are supporting. And the time you really saw that is in question was the final of the Cancun Conference of Parties in the UNCCC, where the Mexican chair was ready to gavel in consensus agreement, and said, "I see no objection," looking past a negotiator from another country, basically standing up on the desk, waving her flag. So there are things that sometimes are done that you look back at them and you think, okay, that's collectively the right outcome, because we then got an agreement in Cancun that we were able to move forward with, but it certainly didn't seem fair to the country representatives still trying to raise an objection or block an agreement.
Well, I think you said,
I was just going to say, clearly consensus is not necessarily a just rule because of the issues that people are coming from. So anyway, this is pretty good.
Well, I think the point you made earlier too about, I think maybe movement and different levels of negotiation and involvement can be happening for years ahead of time and on the peripheries and on the sidelines. And I think this is perhaps one way that, as you said, with the UN Indigenous peoples, they do make a lot of noise and significant contributions, I think, on the peripheries of maybe the conversations that slowly over time will move into the center or be heard in different ways. There's one question I have a couple questions that I want to bring up from the chat. A lot of people concerned about this, and I think Paul mentioned it too, this idea of untangling historical injustices, and I think Susan mentioned it as well, or reparations from contemporary or current problems. And the question says, how do we equitably balance the need for reparations and funding to deal with current issues now? And it sounds like you are saying reparations is a non-starter.
That could change over time or in various settings, but at the time the US and others were negotiating the Paris Agreement and the lead up to it, where there were countries pushing for funds to address loss and damage and talking about them, some of them in terms of reparations. That felt like almost another poison pill. In terms of any support domestically if this agreement had to come back and get congressional approval. You had powerful senators like Senator Burrow saying that why should American taxpayer money go to other countries when we have problems at home that we need to be dealing with? And that actually goes beyond even reparations to help with adaptation. But I think to kind of turn it to how do you advance these issues, it just helps point out how important in a particular country it is to understand what is the domestic approval process for bringing an agreement home, because those are where you often have your levers of influence to get the approval body to be asking for some of these outcomes. One example is in the U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement. The Democrats who were holding, control over whether there would be a vote to approve that agreement were able to tell the U.S. negotiators they had to go to Peru and negotiate a very extensive annex on Peru forest protection. That was to combat illegal logging, and I think it included more consideration of the indigenous peoples in Peru's concerns. But that was basically the chair of, the Democratic chair of a trade committee in the House of Representatives, leading to quite a significant outcome.
So whether there could be capacity building on these backdoor or peripheral negotiations could be an interesting way to even out some of the equity issues, perhaps, to figure out where those levers are. Another question we have from the audience is, are scientists participating significantly in the climate change conservation in diplomatic forums?
Definitely. As you mentioned, or actually in the introduction to our conference sponsor and her participation in the IPCC and its Nobel Prize, the climate negotiations and the implementation of the climate agreements are very much informed by these periodic reports that come out of hundreds of scientists around the world who come together to provide these reports on what's causing climate change, what are the impacts of climate change. The particularly, I think, persuasive one is the special 1.5 degree report that was commissioned of the IPCC as a result of the Paris negotiations, which was, this is a good example, I think, of some of the smaller countries having more say. The small island developing states in particular were pushing for a global goal of 1.5 degrees of warming, because 2 degrees of warming, which most countries had already agreed to, would lead to sea level rise that would basically wipe out a lot of the small island states. So the IPCC scientists were asked, what would the difference be between a goal of 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees? And that has really spurred the conversation in the last couple of years about how urgent it is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the next 10 years by about 45% if we're going to get on this trajectory and avoid these really severe impacts. Also, the Montreal Protocol, one reason that's such a successful agreement is that it has numerous committees of scientists and economists, made up in fact of a lot of university scholars around the world, who advise on particular questions. And the negotiators can say, we need you to advise us on the availability of alternatives to this particular ozone depleting chemical. And so in some fora, that can be very effective. Are the scientists having a lot of impact at the end of the day when an agreement is brought home to be approved? Probably less. That point, it's an awful lot of politics.
Yeah. And I also wonder, are the social scientists, as in the anthropologists, who might be representing some of the interests or working with Indigenous people, do they have voices or brought to any of these? I do know the IPBES and the work with some of the social scientists there seems to make it, it seems to float to the top, but I don't know if it's having much impact on the process.
I don't have a clear sense of that. Which I think is probably tells you something.
An indicator. Yes. I think it's a strong indicator. Susan or Paul, I wonder if you have any follow-up questions you'd like to ask.
I was going to return to one question that I had asked earlier, which is, thinking about the successes in incorporating procedural and distributive justice in various forms in these frameworks. What is driving that inclusion? Is that happening, because of the alignments of different political blocs, like of nations, or is it because national interests are heeding the importance of justice? And what are the possibilities there for making justice issues part of the natural interests, especially thinking about the United States?
I think that in some of these fora, the justice issues as defined as the different capacities of nation states around the table are there because of the countries from less developed circumstances have more and more voice in the negotiations, whether it's because it's a consensus-based decision-making process or because, say, in a body like the WTO, so many developing countries have joined that agreement since the WTO was created in 1994, that it was quite an upheaval in that institution to figure out how to accommodate those voices, how to bring them up to speed, how to acknowledge that they needed special accommodations. I would say often in the environmental negotiations that I've seen, the US negotiators under at least the Obama administration, and I hope under a Biden administration, are very much motivated by ambitious results in the negotiations and recognizing that those results are not achieved unless you have all the countries around the table, seeing that it's in their interest to come together. And that requires addressing the particular circumstances of the less advantaged countries. Just briefly, I think this is relevant, but another development that I think has been very interesting has been, for many years, the less developed countries in a lot of these fora participated almost as a bloc. There was the G77 plus China in a lot of these fora. And as some of these countries developed as you want them to and became economies in transition, or as a country like China became the largest annual emitter of greenhouse gases, you saw some of the much less developed countries seeing that their interests no longer aligned with the economies in transition. And this was especially powerful in finishing up Paris, and then also the aviation and Montreal Protocol negotiations. There was a group of over 100 countries called the High Ambition Coalition. And it was, a lot of the Africa group, a lot of the Latin American countries who themselves were not high emitters. So they were especially on the receiving end of the impacts of climate change. And so they became aligned with others trying for ambitious outcomes, because it was clear that it was in their interest to move in that direction and to push all the big emitters, whatever side of that divide they used to be on, toward greater mitigation obligations.
I'm going to see if there's any other questions out in the audience. Here's one that I don't know if you can answer, but how are the promised financial contributions embedded in the Paris Accord? Are they becoming a reality? Maybe you could say more just about what they are for the larger audience. Yeah.
There are a few things. One is there's one fund called the Adaptation Fund that was to help developing countries adapt. That, at least under the Kyoto Protocol, was financed in part by certain fees that came off trading of units, clean development mechanism units. And then there was also in 2009, I think it was, a commitment by the developed countries to mobilize climate finance by 2020 of about $100 million a year, $100 billion a year. And that's nowhere near achieved. The language around that was to mobilize climate finance, private and public finance. And so I think that just generally public finance is very difficult to get countries to contribute to these purposes. So finding ways to mobilize the private finance is essential. And I would also say that it doesn't help when you have wealthy countries' governments not particularly interested in contributing to these things. Right. So hopefully there will be a big change come January.
Just add something to this. One issue, I've been working with a UN panel that has to do with financial. It's we're just 15 people. We don't have any power, but we're thinking about it. An issue that came up there that you referenced was the lack of just administrative capacity in countries, particularly low-income countries with small populations, but not only that, there's some with big populations too, and the tension between the importance of them actually taking some steps in the financial integrity side or in the global warming side, that it's important. They're not like your countries that you were mentioning that are not big emitters. Some of these countries are big emitters. how does have your international negotiations thought about that problem, about sort of feasible requirements, not just compensating people, but sort of feasible requirements for countries which have a background condition of relatively poorly operating institutional structures?
Mm-hmm. The climate finance is not an area of particular familiarity for me, so take this with that caveat, but I know that this has been manifested somewhat in some of the very contentious negotiations around the funds that have been created in these negotiations to help the developing countries, where some of the developing countries are very frustrated by how long it can take to get access to funds if you're following like World Bank procedures. So that's perspective on one side of the table. And then the perspective on the side of the countries who are donating these funds are, but if we circumvent those procedures and have something more streamlined, what is the guarantee that this money is going where it's supposed to go, to be used for what it's supposed to be used for? Because of exactly as you've mentioned and have written and worked on, is the whole questions of governance and corruption in some countries. So it's definitely something that is that you see in the negotiations. I don't have good answers for how to resolve it. So I'm glad you have a group of people working on it. Susan, you're on mute.
I would just say we're not likely to solve that problem either. Maybe it's able to be talked about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Try to do
well,
so.
It looks like we're just about at time. I need to, let's see, there are people asking if this has been recorded, and the answer is yes. It'll be up on the website, I imagine, in a couple of days. I'm trying to figure out, we're coming to an end, and we now get to go into the lounge where we can chit chat and enjoy our self-brought cocktails or whatever we have. But I really want to thank you all, Jennifer, Susan, Paul, for a really interesting discussion. I think there's a lot there for all of us, whether you're on the science end or the advocacy end or the scholarship end. There's a need for a lot of contributions and deep thinking about this issue of national self-interest, about issues of global justice, and then also, how do we deal with the differences between justice issues at smaller national scales and then as they scale up to global. I think that it's quite clear that what happens in practice is the sausage making is just about as challenging as we all imagine it is. But the way I see it is that there's lots of space for really strong action to advocate for different viewpoints, different minority groups to come together in coalitions and have their voices being heard, or find where are those small levers that perhaps they can find some value in pulling those. And so we often tend to focus on the big negotiations because that's what the news does, but there's also so much happening on the sides.